The crystal goblets were already vibrating from the tension, but it was a simple reach for the cranberry sauce that finally shattered the room. I extended my arm across the mahogany table, and for a fraction of a second, the cuff of my beige cashmere sweater rode up, just an inch. That was all it took. The ink on my inner wrist, usually hidden beneath tactical gear or long sleeves, caught the flickering candlelight. It's not a normal tattoo. It's a jagged, black brand of a hawk plummeting inside a geometric storm, a symbol that doesn't exist in any public database. The room didn't react, Butch did. Mark, my brother-in-law, a man who prides himself on knowing the agency's secrets, froze mid-chew. His fork hit the porcelain plate with a violence that made everyone jump, the clatter echoing like a gunshot in the silent dining room. He didn't apologize. He couldn't even breathe. He gripped his wife's arm, his knuckles turning the color of bone, his eyes locked on my wrist with a terror I'd only ever seen in deep-sight interrogation rooms, where he wheezed, his voice trembling so hard the words barely came out. "Where did you get that?" "That's the Skyfall design. That's the Wetworks Logistics Division. Chloe always said she wanted a hero in the family. The problem is, she didn't know that real heroes don't wear capes. They wear scars." To understand why Mark looks like he's seen a ghost, we have to go back to the appetizers. 2 hours earlier, the air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and my sister's suffocating arrogance. Chloe, my older sister, a woman who treated every family gathering like her own personal press conference, was holding court at the head of the table. She had spent the last 40 minutes curating a myth, turning her husband's mundane government job into a high-stakes spy thriller. She introduced Mark as if he were James Bond himself, hinting at dangerous missions and classified dossiers that I knew for a fact didn't exist. I sat there, quietly sipping my cheap wine, knowing full well that Mark was a mid-level desk analyst who mostly tracked regional supply chains for office furniture in Brussels. But the truth didn't matter to Chloe. Only the spotlight did. Eventually, she grew bored of praising him and decided it was time to pivot to her favorite pastime, dismantling me. She turned her gaze down the table, a pitying, shark-like smile plastered on her face. "It's sweet, really," she purred, making sure the whole table was listening. "Mark saves the world, and Elena saves receipts." The table chuckled, a polite, orchestrated sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. She leaned in, twisting the knife with practiced ease. "But someone has to keep the dust off the shelves at the Library of Congress, right? It's safe, quiet, just like you." Mark laughed along, puffing his chest out, enjoying the ego boost of being the protector, the warrior. He sat there, grinning at his wife's cruelty, completely unaware that he was breaking bread with a ghost. He had no idea that the boring archivist sitting across from him held level 5 Blackstone clearance, and that while he was tracking staplers, I was erasing names from existence. The dynamic at our family table has always been a perfectly staged play, and tonight was no exception. My mother, Carol, a woman who measured human worth strictly by tax brackets and wedding rings, was practically vibrating with pride every time Mark opened his mouth to complain about the Bureau. To them, Mark's job was a high-octane thriller, even though I knew his dangerous life mostly consisted of fighting with formatting on PowerPoint slides and arguing over per diems for conferences in Omaha. Yet, they looked at him like he was the only thing standing between civilization and anarchy, hanging on his every exaggerated word, while treating me like a fragile piece of furniture that hadn't quite justified its purchase price. It wasn't just that they worshipped him, it was the way they systematically dismantled me to do it. My father, a man who hadn't asked me a serious question about my life since I was 12, leaned over the mashed potatoes with a benevolent, pitying smile. He started talking about one of Mark's friends from the IT department, suggesting I should meet him because he was quiet and simple, just like me. I just nodded, pushing peas around my plate, listening to the familiar cadence of their disappointment. I thought about the irony of it, how they handled me with kid gloves, terrified I might break completely, unaware that the hands holding the fork had snapped necks and toppled regimes before breakfast. They see a spinster librarian who files papers, they have no idea they are sitting across from the architect. In my world, the real world, I don't just read history, I curate it in real time. I run the logistics for shadow sites, the Black Ops interrogation and extraction, Centers that don't appear on any map and certainly don't exist in any budget report. I don't carry a gun because I am the weapons system itself. I authorize burn notices for compromised assets and coordinate extraordinary rendition logistics across borders that are supposed to be closed. While my family worries about traffic on the I-95, I am the one deciding which ghosts get to come back from the dead and which ones stay buried. The dissonance between their narrative and my reality is almost hallucinogenic. Just last week, while Chloe was having a meltdown over the specific shade of cream for these very dinner napkins, I was standing in a rain-slicked alley in Beirut, holding a secure sat phone. I wasn't debating linen. I was negotiating the release of a deep-cover asset, using a black-budget slush fund that exceeded the GDP of small nations. I remembered the cold rain on my neck and the metallic taste of adrenaline as I waited for the confirmation code. And now, I was watching Chloe cry because the gravy boat didn't match the tablecloth. It's hard to respect the drama of a family dinner when you've held the weight of human lives in your palm. Then came the moment that almost made me break character. Chloe, drunk on wine and her own self-importance, smirked at me and asked, "Elena, be honest, do you even have security clearance to enter the staff room at the library? Or do you have to wait outside with the interns?" The table erupted in laughter, but my mind flashed back to a very different room. I was back in the skiff, the sensitive compartmented information facility, standing toe-to-toe with a 3-star general who thought his rank gave him the right to scream at me. I remembered his face turning purple when I cut him off, my voice barely a whisper, telling him to stand down because my authority supersedes your stars under Protocol 7 Alpha. I remembered the silence that followed, the way a room full of powerful men shrank when they realized I held the leash. But here, I am just Elena the archivist, and Mark, poor deluded Mark, is the useful idiot of the intelligence community. He knows enough to be dangerous but not enough to be terrified. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, and started talking about the Skyfall unit. He described it as a spook story they tell junior analysts. A unit that doesn't officially exist, a boogeyman for the bad guys. He spoke about it with a mix of reverence and fear, thrilled by the idea of such unchecked power. He had no idea that the spook story was buttering a dinner roll 3 feet away from him. He didn't know that Skyfall isn't a myth. It's the woman he was about to dismiss as irrelevant. Chloe wasn't satisfied with just the general praise. She needed specific, tangible glory to parade around the table. She nudged Mark, her voice dripping with performative awe, and demanded he tell the story. "Come on, honey, tell them about that classified trip to DC last month. You know, the one where you couldn't call me for 3 days?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water to hide the smirk threatening to break my cover. I knew that trip. It was a supply chain logistics conference at a Marriott in Bethesda. But Mark, emboldened by the attention and the wine, leaned back and sighed heavily, acting like he carried the weight of national security on his sloping shoulders. He started spinning a tale about shadow assets and dead drops, borrowing terminology he'd probably heard in the break room but clearly didn't understand. Then, reality intruded on his fantasy. Mark's phone buzzed on the table, a standard-issue agency BlackBerry, clunky and outdated. A second later, a low, rhythmic vibration hummed against my thigh. It wasn't a text. It was a priority alert. I pulled my phone out to silence it, and for the first time that night, Mark's eyes sharpened. He stopped his story mid-sentence. He wasn't looking at my face, he was staring at the device in my hand. It looks like a smartphone to civilians, but to anyone who's actually read the manual, the modified chassis, the lack of a brand logo, and the heavy-duty encryption port are dead giveaways. Mark frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion as his analyst brain finally kicked into gear. "Elena," he started, his voice losing its bravado. Is that an encrypted burst transmitter? Why do you have a heavy-duty battery case on a librarian's phone?" The table went quiet. My father looked up, confused, but Mark kept staring. He was putting it together, the callus on my trigger finger I'd been hiding, the way I sat facing the exit, and now, the tech that was 3 generations ahead of his own. I slipped the phone back into my pocket with practiced nonchalance. "It's just an old model, Mark," I said, keeping my voice flat and uninteresting. I'm frugal. I don't upgrade until I have to. It was the perfect cover. Elena, the cheap, boring sister. Mark seemed to accept it, or at least he was trying to rationalize it away. Chloe, however, didn't like the spotlight shifting. She didn't see the tech, she just saw her husband paying attention to the invisible sibling. She needed to reassert dominance, to remind everyone of the hierarchy. She reached across the table, her eyes locking onto my wrist. "Oh, speaking of being frugal," she sneered, her voice high and brittle. "Is that the same cheap charm bracelet you've had since college? God, Elena, treat yourself. I just wanted to finish my pie and leave." But Chloe had to grab my arm. She had to pull back the curtain, and once you see the monster, you can't unsee it. Chloe didn't just pull my sleeve, she yanked it, desperate to expose whatever cheap plastic jewelry she assumed I was wearing. But there was no bracelet. As the beige cashmere slid up my forearm, the candlelight caught the ink, dark, jagged, and undeniable. It wasn't the rebel phase butterfly she expected, it was the skyfall sigil. The hawk plummeting inside a geometric storm branded into the skin. For a second, the room was still. I felt a familiar rush of adrenaline, not of fear, but of grim anticipation. I looked at Mark, watching the color drain from his face as if someone had pulled a plug. His reaction was immediate and violent. Mark scrambled backward, his legs tangling in the legs of his expensive dining chair, sending it crashing to the floor with a deafening wooden crack. He didn't even look at the damage. His eyes were wide, fixed on my wrist, like it was a live grenade that had just had the pin pulled. "Let go of her arm, Chloe," he hissed, his voice strangled and unrecognizable. "Let go. Now." Chloe froze, her hand hovering in the air, completely confused by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. She looked from the mark on my skin to her husband, letting out a nervous, incredulous laugh that grated against the sudden heavy silence. "What is wrong with you?" she asked, rolling her eyes at him. "It's just a tattoo, Mark. Probably some trashy thing she got during a breakup in college." "God, you're so dramatic." "That's not a tattoo," Mark whispered, and the genuine terror in his voice finally pierced Chloe's bubble of arrogance. He pointed a shaking finger at me, refusing to make eye contact, as if looking at me directly would turn him to stone. "That's a unit designation. Skyfall isn't a place. And it's not a desk job, it's the call sign for shadow site operations." He looked at his wife, desperate to make her understand the gravity of the mistake she had just made. "They don't have archives, Chloe. They have kill lists." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lung. I watched Mark connect the dots, his mind racing through every classified rumor he'd ever heard, every redacted file he'd been denied access to, realizing the ghost he feared was sitting across from him passing the gravy. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in 10 years. "You," he stammered, swallowing hard against a dry throat. "You're not an archivist. You're the station chief. You're the one who signs the redaction orders." I didn't deny it. There was no point in the charade anymore. I slowly, deliberately rolled my sleeve back down, covering the sigil. I locked eyes with him, letting the full weight of my clearance level bear down on him, a weight he was nowhere near strong enough to carry. "Sit down, analyst," I said softly. "You're making a scene?" The command was quiet, but it carried the absolute authority of a superior officer. Mark sat. He didn't argue, he didn't joke. He collapsed into his chair, instinctively obeying the chain of command. My parents sat in stunned silence, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths, unable to process the shift. Chloe, desperate to regain control of her narrative, let out a shrill, disbelief-laden laugh. "Don't be ridiculous," she scoffed, though her voice wavered. "She's just Elena. She organizes books." Then the table vibrated. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a priority encryption code red. My hands were still greasy from the turkey, so I tapped the speaker button without hesitation. The voice that filled the dining room was distorted, metallic, and utterly devoid of humanity. "Director, Operation Nightshade is green-lit. We need your biometric authorization key to deploy the drone wing. Asset is in the kill box." I leaned forward, speaking into the device in a language none of them recognized, technical, precise, and lethal. "Authorization Alpha 9 Zulu," I said, my voice icy calm. "Execute." I tapped the screen to end the call and looked up. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore, It was deafening. The silence that followed my command to the drone wing wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room and leaving my family gasping in the sudden, harsh clarity of the truth. I looked around the table at the people who had spent 3 decades minimizing my existence, their faces now masks of pale, unadulterated shock. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, the specific shade of cream Chloe had agonized over for 45 minutes, and deliberately dabbed the corner of my mouth. I placed it on the table, the soft fabric making a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I looked at my sister, whose arrogance had finally, fatally collided with reality. "The turkey was dry, Chloe," I said, my voice devoid of any malice, stating, "It's simply as a fact of life, just like the airstrike I had just authorized." I pushed my chair back and stood up, the movement fluid and sharp, a stark contrast to the slouched, invisible posture I had adopted for their benefit for years. Mark remained frozen in his chair, his eyes darting between me and his standard issue phone, his mind clearly racing through the terrified calculus of government protocol. He looked small. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who filled out forms for a living and played pretend on the weekends. His voice, when he finally found it, was thin and brittle, shaking with the tremors of a bureaucrat realizing he has stumbled into a minefield. "Elena," he started, swallowing hard. Do I need to report this contact because of the clearance conflict? If you're operating under a Title 50 covert action authority and I've witnessed a command sequence, I might be in violation of..." He trailed off, his rules and regulations failing him. I looked down at him, and for the first time I felt a twinge of genuine pity. He was so desperate to believe that his rules still applied to me. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Don't worry, Mark," I said softly, leaning in just enough to make him flinch. "You don't have high enough clearance to even report me. If you tried to type my call sign into your system, your terminal would just go dark. As far as the agency is concerned, I was never here. This dinner never happened. And you..." I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. "You are just a supply analyst who had too much wine." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the front door, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor with a rhythmic precision that sounded like a countdown. My parents, usually so quick to offer criticism or unwanted advice, sat like statues, rendered mute by the sheer scale of their own ignorance. They didn't ask where I was going. They didn't ask when I would be back. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that they had never really known the stranger eating at their table. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the cool night air. The suburban quiet was instantly broken by the presence of my reality. A black government SUV with tinted windows and reinforced plating was idling at the curb, its engine purring with a low, menacing rumble. It was a machine of war parked next to minivans and sedans. As I descended the porch steps, the rear door opened. 2 large men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the perimeter with professional paranoia. They didn't wave, they didn't smile. One of them, a man who had pulled me out of a firefight in Damascus 2 years ago, simply nodded and held the door. "Director," he murmured, a title that carried more weight in one word than sister or daughter ever had in a lifetime. I slid into the leather interior, the smell of gun oil and conditioned air replacing the scent of overcooked poultry. As the door slammed shut, sealing me back into my world, I looked out the window. Through the gap in the curtains of the dining room window, I saw them. My family. They were huddled together, peering out into the dark, watching the red taillights of my convoy fade into the distance. They looked like children watching a storm roll in, small, confused, and completely helpless against the elements. 3 months have passed since that night. I haven't been back for a Sunday dinner, and the invitations have stopped coming. From what I hear through the grapevine, and by grapevine I mean the surveillance reports I occasionally glance at, the fallout was absolute. Chloe and Mark are separated, pending divorce. It wasn't the secrecy that broke them, it was the humiliation. Chloe, a woman who needed her husband to be a titan, to validate her own self-worth, couldn't survive the image of him cowering before her invisible little sister. The fantasy she had built her life around shattered the moment she saw fear in his eyes. I received a single email from Mark last week. It was sent to my old, civilian email address, the one I only check for spam. It had no subject line. The body of the message was just one sentence. I didn't say anything. It was a plea for mercy, a confirmation that he was keeping my secret not out of loyalty but out of self-preservation. He knows that in my world, loose ends get tied off, and he is terrified of becoming a loose end. I deleted the email without replying. I sat back in my chair, the one in the corner office with the view of the Potomac, and thought about the years of silence I had endured. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinners where I was interrupted, the birthdays where I was given gift cards, because they didn't know what I liked, and the endless patronizing lectures about finding a stable job. I used to think my silence was a weakness, a failure to assert myself. Now, I realize it was camouflage. The loudest people in the room are usually the weakest. They fill the air with noise because they are terrified of what the silence might reveal about their own mediocrity. True power doesn't need to brag at a dinner table. True power doesn't need to be acknowledged by a sister who measures success in designer handbags or a father who measures it in loud stories. True power is the ability to change the world without anyone knowing your name until it's too late for them to do anything about it. My sister spent her whole life trying to be the main character of a spy novel. She never realized she was just the comic relief in a documentary. If you have a secret side to your life that your family ignores, let me know in the comments. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage.